Hello and welcome back to another episode of the EV Life podcast. I'm your host, Crystal, and I'm joined by Hannah Neal.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So we have another great interview lined up today. We'll be talking to Lance Mortlock, Managing Partner of Energy and Resources Canada with EY.
Yeah, so this is an interesting episode. So we're talking about micromobility, which is a little bit different than our other topics because the other topics do focus more around actual cars. And so micromobility talks more to the audience that is maybe interested more in e-scooters, e-bikes, maybe you don't drive. So you're looking at alternate transportation options. So this conversation is for you.
Yeah, and it's more specifically about those public sharing of like these e-scooters and e-bikes, which over the past few years have popped up in several cities across Alberta. So it's a pretty interesting conversation. Lance shares about how he sees adoption of these modes of transportation becoming more prevalent and the benefit to municipalities from that.
Yeah, Alberta is actually one of the leading provinces in this area, which is super interesting. And they actually have a report on that on their website, which we will link in the show notes so you can see more details about those stats. But yeah.
Let's listen to my interview with Lance Mortlock, Managing Partner of Energy and Resources Canada with EY. Hi, Lance. Thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to the conversation.
Can you tell us a little bit about EY and what your role is there?
So EY is, for your listeners, a global professional services organization. We're close to 400,000 people, and we provide services around audit, tax, consulting, and strategy and transactions. And we really essentially solve complex problems for our clients.
So how did EY get involved in micromobility? And can you, for our listeners who've never heard of the term micromobility, it is kind of a new term. Can you explain what that means?
My role within EY is to run our energy and mining organization in Canada nationally. So I have the privilege of guiding a number of professionals that support our clients, both in the oil and gas, the power and utility, the mining and metals, and the advanced manufacturing and mobility space. And in supporting those clients, we come up with solutions to problems. We help our clients solve problems and be better organizations in the future. In my capacity as a leader within the firm, it struck me that the mobility and the power and utility sectors specifically, and to some extent oil and gas when I think about downstream retail, gas stations, and therefore EV charging, is undergoing a huge amount of transformation. And it's actually pretty exciting. I'd say it's daunting, but it's exciting. And so as we started to explore this idea of mobility that's changing through electrification, we naturally started to talk more and explore and research micromobility, and that's how we got into it. Micromobility is really this idea of a collection of publicly available electric-powered vehicles primarily used for what we call last-minute transportation. So these often include things like scooters, e-scooters, bicycles, e-bikes, and in some instances, e-mopeds. And shared e-scooters and e-bikes are usually owned and administrated by private operators, regulated by individual cities, and really made accessible to the residents and visitors of the city on the public right-of-way.
Yeah, in Alberta, for our listeners, there are e-scooters that are in quite a few different municipalities. And then more recently, e-bikes were also added. So that's kind of what you're talking about, those pay-per-use bikes and scooters that we kind of see around in the summertime.
That's right.
So EY did a study on the evolving landscape of e-mobility in Canada, and the focus was on micromobility. So can you share a little bit about why the study was conducted and what some of those findings were?
We did the study because we believe it's important for EY to have a point of view on topics of change and disruption that are occurring. And this is an area that's evolving, it's gathering momentum, and we wanted to explore this further and kind of do our part in terms of saying, well, what is it? Why is it important? How can we accelerate it? Particularly given the backdrop of energy transition, growing cities, more people in Canada, more people in the planet. Transportation is evolving. And so our study was about exploring that, about understanding the nuances involved. And I think it's our role as a professional services provider. We're expected to bring important insight to the public and to our clients. And we certainly try and do that within the firm. It's interesting because e-scooter market size, we would estimate by 2027, is going to be $2.5 billion. The bike sharing market size by 2027 is going to be $4.9 billion. And there are roughly 149 shared micromobility operators around the world. These are global numbers, by the way.
Okay.
So, these are big numbers. There's big activity happening. And I think it's pretty exciting. There are a number of barriers that we need to think about. And we talk about this in our report, and I think it still holds true in terms of adoption. One, you need good infrastructure to support e-bikes and e-scooters. You need good regulation, like a lot of the regulation around the ability to deploy e-scooters and e-bikes is controlled by municipal governments in Canada. So you need clear, concise, and helpful regulation and frameworks to implement this across cities in Canada. You need also good industry collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Consumer perceptions is also a barrier. I think, there is still perception that this is a nuisance versus an enabler, but we need to understand and we need to do a better job of managing consumer perception around this, that these things that clutter the sidewalks,
right,
if done well, can be very helpful.
And that's where the regulation comes in?
Absolutely. Yeah. And weather, of course, and then safety concerns, which is, people can really hurt themselves if they're kind of zooming down the road without a helmet on.
Mm-hmm. I think just to your point, when I hear frustrations around these e-scooters and e-bikes, it's typically around them kind of causing clutter. And so, yeah, I do think like the regulations would help with that, and maybe it wouldn't be seen as so much of a nuisance.
Agreed. Yeah, 100%.
So what trends have you noticed in adoption over the past few years, particularly in Canada and on the prairies where, as you kind of mentioned, we're really limited by the seasons?
Yeah, I mean, it's the trends. And I think as I look to the future of shared micromobility in Canada, in the next 3 to 10 years, we're probably going to see sort of more services, more companies coming into our cities. But then I think we're going to quickly move to market consolidation. What will be interesting is the continued role that we see big companies like Uber and Lyft, and what role do they want to play in terms of micromobility? And do we see some of the smaller companies get acquired by those companies? That market consolidation could be a trend, and that's something that we're certainly watching. And then I think longer term, and I'm talking sort of 5 years plus, we're going to start to see continued momentum around AI, autonomy, and robotics. And this is where it gets really interesting, because right now, when you look at, say, Edmonton or Calgary or Vancouver, these different cities, people are going around picking up the scooters to recharge them, then redeploying them or changing the batteries out. So that's pretty interesting, that autonomy, that AI, that robotics. And then, the wider trend is around mobility as a service. So it's not only about the scooter, but it's about the bike, the bus, a full integrated transport mobility system for cities where you're using a single app to get on the bus, to get on the train, to get on the scooter, to get on the bike, to get on the moped, to get in your car, your shared vehicle, a fully integrated, city-wide, multi-purpose transport system, which really transforms this idea of traditional internal combustion engine that I'm going to get in my car and go to the restaurant, where it's going to be much more multi-purpose. Well, if the restaurant's close, I'm going to use an e-scooter. Maybe it's further away. I use a bike. Further away, I use a shared car, and I'm using an integrated app for that. And with all of this, of course, it's more efficient, it's lower cost, and the emissions is far lower.
Were there any things that you noticed specifically in Alberta that might have been surprising?
I would challenge the listeners that are from outside of Alberta, don't underestimate the level of innovation that's going on in this province. And that extends to the level of adoption around micromobility, which has been some of the highest adoption rates in the country, both in Edmonton and Calgary and other cities.
That's surprising.
Absolutely. A lot of innovation is happening in this province because when I think about what's important to innovate, whether it's in e-mobility or other areas related to energy transition, part of it's not only the ideation, but it's the activation and the commercialization of those ideas. And when you look at a place like Alberta, that can-do, action-oriented, kind of get-it-done mentality is key to innovation.
This was, such a great conversation. Obviously, I've learned a lot. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience about micromobility?
I mean, maybe what I would conclude with saying is that if we're going to accelerate the growth of shared micromobility in Canada, probably 4 things we need to think about. One is this idea that public-private partnerships are essential. We need private companies to work with municipal governments to bring this to our cities and municipalities across the country. Secondly, solutions need to be easily accessible. And what I mean by that is, municipal governments need to develop strategies to help subsidize the cost of shared micromobility in some way and bring consumer-facing solutions. That brings me to the third point, which is the consumer or the customer experience needs to be a priority for operators in cities. If it's not, people just won't use it. And finally, I'd say shared micromobility needs to be implemented with the future in mind. City planners need to be thinking very long term because the infrastructure that you put in now is going to be very hard to pull out later. So think about that blueprint, think about the long term and do it right.
Lance, thank you so much. This was, again, such an insightful conversation, and I appreciate you coming on to the podcast today and speaking to us.
No problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lance today. Of course, we will have links in our show notes for you to check out resources. And if you'd like to weigh in on the conversation, you can do so by joining the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We'll talk to you next week.